latest campaign to protect the planet, sea ice. We're now joined by Greenpeace Africa's spokesperson, Melita Steele. Melita, thanks so much for joining us. Fascinating. That's a great idea. How did you guys come up with it?
Thanks for having me here this afternoon. The reason that Greenpeace did something like this is because we're starting actually a really amazing voyage that is going from pole to pole, so from the North Pole to the Southern Pole, to highlight the importance of ocean sanctuaries and protecting our oceans, but also the impact of climate change. And so the voyage is actually starting at the North Pole in the Arctic, and that's why we pulled some musicians together, and the instruments are made out of ice to sort of resonate with the idea that ice is very fragile, and because of climate change the ice caps are melting.
All right, we'll talk about the journey just now. But this, I mean, help us understand, because, you know, we're in Joburg, in Gauteng, and our concept of ice is when we go to the garage to get ice for a braai. But the North and the South Pole play a critical role in our very existence. Just put it into context for us.
Absolutely. So both the North Pole and the South Pole are incredibly important in terms of ocean currents, for example. And so the ocean currents then control the temperature of the oceans, and that then controls the kind of life that you can find in those oceans. So what is happening is because of climate change, which is the average warming of the Earth's atmosphere, those ice caps in the poles are melting at a very large scale. And so in the long term, one of the most significant impacts of climate change is that because of the melting ice caps, we're actually going to start seeing sea level rises and the changing of those patterns and streams within the oceans.
All right, so sea level rises as well. That means a lot of our port cities could technically become submerged.
Exactly. So we're already living with the impacts of climate change. So I think part of the issue around climate change is we often think that it's a future problem. But we just have to look at Cyclone Idai, Kenneth, the floods in KZN to see that extreme weather is happening more and more frequently. And so, yes, we are looking at sea level rise that we can't even imagine at this stage unless we act to stop climate change. And at the same time, protecting our oceans is a really critical part of that.
All right, and as you say, the sea life, so even from a food security point of view, the fish that we fish, is going to change with what's going on.
Exactly. So part of what Greenpeace is advocating for is the protection of our oceans through ocean sanctuaries, which are areas of the ocean in which fishing is not allowed to happen, right? So areas of regeneration within our oceans. And what we're finding at the moment is that the impacts of industrial fishing, climate change and plastic pollution are all combining to really devastate not only the oceans, but also the marine species that live there and that we rely on, and that fishermen and fisher folk rely on for their lives.
So much going on at different levels, and 70% of our planet is water, so it's an important area to focus on. All right, so tell us about this journey. How is it going to play out? What do you hope to do along the way?
So one of the key things that initialized this voyage, this expedition, is because there are actually negotiations that are happening at the moment, which are moving towards a global ocean treaty. So trying to create ocean sanctuaries within international waters. And those negotiations end in spring 2020, so next year. So the idea of this voyage is that Greenpeace wants to take those negotiations out of the halls of the UN and really through a year-long voyage that goes from the Arctic all the way down to the Antarctic, and will actually, one of the ships will actually come very close to South Africa, to investigate and demonstrate exactly what is happening in our oceans and draw in a movement of people who are calling on governments to recognize the importance of ocean sanctuaries.
All right, so how do we get the message down to ordinary citizens who are never going to be at the sea but are being affected by what's happening?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges around climate change, is that it feels too big, and it's the same with ocean sanctuaries. So at the moment, 1% of our oceans are actually protected, and we're looking at 30% by 2030. I think one of the key things that people can do is connect with organizations like Greenpeace. We have a lot of content like this musical concert that we're trying to put out in order to connect with people. There isn't a global oceans treaty petition that people can look for online and sign, and really connect with Greenpeace in a way that recognizes that oceans, not only are they beautiful, but they are actually core to our existence.
How well are you doing in persuading the authorities to join the party? I mean, I see Donald Trump has almost done a U-turn to where America was going. And when you have a superpower like this, it starts to become difficult, because they have to be a critical part of saving the planet, especially our oceans.
Absolutely. And so I think one of the great fears when Donald Trump came in was that there would be backsliding, that people would start to actually shift away from action on climate change. But we're seeing other countries stepping up to take the lead. In fact, South Africa is very progressive in terms of ocean sanctuaries and protecting the oceans in the negotiations. But we're also starting to see movements growing around the world. So the student strikes that are happening, Fridays for the Future, the next student strike is actually next week Friday, are a clear indication that the youth of the world, so it is a worldwide movement, are seeing climate change as a crisis, as an emergency, and they're calling on governments to act with more urgency. And so I think those things are sort of coming together to create a counterbalance.
How big of a story is it in the halls of the African Union and other African bodies? Are you getting airtime? Are you getting platforms to explain that this is serious? I mean, we see Idai, the devastation that it caused, and then the subsequent storm. Are you getting a listening to?
Well, when it comes to oceans and ocean sanctuaries, I think African countries and the AU and the Africa Group are actually very progressive, because they recognize that people in their countries are heavily reliant on the oceans to survive. When it comes to climate change, again, the African groups, the African countries are pretty progressive. But then you have a country like South Africa, which likes to pay lip service to climate change. So internationally, we talk about the importance of acting on climate change, but then domestically, we're investing in more coal, which drives climate change. So we need governments to start being coherent in terms of their policies, and in particular in South Africa, we need to be shifting away from coal.
All right, Melita, we're going to have to leave it there, but we certainly look forward to this journey when it swings by South Africa. Perhaps we'll get a chance to talk to you again and see this expedition and some of the stories that you'll have gathered along the way. But thank you so much for bringing this to our attention, and I want us to take another look at these amazing instruments made of ice.